Hello. So this slideshow is going to cover hands in general, get you to think about the ways that we use hands in our everyday life. And the slideshow is also going to introduce and explain the project that they'll be doing with hands. So hands, they are made of bone as well as lots of complex muscle tissue. It allows us to move our fingers and our thumb and our wrist all in sorts of ways. There's actually many tiny bones that make up the hands, which is why it's much more complicated when you do break a part of your hand. Our hands are part of our identity, not just in terms of a fingerprint or a handprint, but basically for a very, very long time, we have existed as humans with 5 fingers on each hand. Our hands are made up of different lines, shapes, wrinkles, and they're all unique. There are no two handprints that are exactly the same. Yes, you can learn about somebody according to their hand. With this photo here, we can see this person works out a lot. If you've ever heard of palmistry, that is where people read your palm to predict your future or information about your past. If you're very curious, do your own Google search about this. There's lots of cool information about palmistry. Hands can also tell us about somebody's age. So we have a photo here of a small baby's hand, maybe a middle-aged person's hand, and then a hand of someone who is much older. And we can tell definitely by the skin condition. We decorate our hands in order to communicate something about ourselves. Our hands allow us to use all different types of tools. That's because our fingers can manipulate in various ways in order to hold all different types of tools, all different forms. And you can see our fingers, right? For knitting, our fingers have to move in a certain way in order to manipulate the needles and the yarn, even to learn to use scissors, right? Think about it when you were a little child and you're learning how to use scissors. To us, we take it for granted now that we are older, but when you're a little child, it's a very complex thing. Our hands often reflect how we feel. So we often show our feelings with our hands as well. It's a way that we communicate with others. Yes, we can use words and facial expressions, but we also use our hands. There's also ASL, which is American Sign Language. So it's another way that we communicate. So if you are deaf, which means you cannot hear very well or you cannot hear at all, you might learn to use American Sign Language, which is a series of hand movements and gestures to communicate information. If these moving images are entertaining you, just search ASL GIF or ASL GIFs on Google, and you'll find lots of very interesting short little videos that will teach you common ASL gestures. Our hands communicate through greetings, signs, and symbols as well. And did you know the handshake in ancient Greece was originally believed to be used to make sure that the person you were meeting wasn't carrying a concealed weapon? So that means if someone is reaching out towards you to shake your hand, that might mean they're not going to try to kill you later on. So again, we talk with our hands, right? So Did you know that people who talk with their hands, they move their hands a lot as they're speaking to somebody? They tend to be more viewed as warm, agreeable, and energetic versus those who don't move their hands as much, which might seem more logical, cold, and analytical. So think about a teacher you've had in the past. You might have a teacher who uses their hands a lot when they talk. Does that teacher come off as more energetic versus maybe a teacher who just stands and maybe holds a piece of paper while talking to the class? So hand gestures, they help us understand what's in our minds. And there's actually a brain region known as the Broca's area that's actually partly responsible for this. So this area of the brain has developed to allow us to understand people as they're talking with their hands. It's connected to speech production, but it's also active when people are waving their hands around as they're talking. So continuing with the idea that we talk with our hands, hand motions can reveal information that might be absent in our speech. For example, you might be gesturing that something is more important than something else if you're explaining an idea, or the speaker is just wrapping their head around an idea, and so they're using their hands to gesticulate. So what do we do with our hands during a job interview? This is what not to do when you're going for a job interview. So hand gestures, they're a healthy part of child development. Children learn, some parents like to teach their children sign language even before they're grasping visual and speaking language. So using hand gestures early in life, they can predict that a child will later develop a strong vocabulary, especially skills related to sentence structure and storytelling. So to practice before we actually get to our final project, you're going to complete a series of skill building exercises using methods demonstrated by me as well as others. There's some really good resources out there on how to create ceramic hands. So this is the skill building portion, and your objectives are to use additive and subtractive processes to construct a hand and parts of the hand. You're going to make observations of your own hand when constructing a proportional hand made of clay. So we're going to be using your own hands as models. And you're using a variety of pottery tools to carve and sculpt the clay because you're going to be adding to that clay as well as removing clay. So the first two skill building exercises just focus on creating a straight index finger with a nail and the details. We're going to be creating a finger that's the same size as your index finger, and we're going to be including details for the top, bottom, and sides of that finger. The second practice activity is you're going to create a bent thumb made of separate pieces. So you're going to learn about creating joints. We need to include a nail, wrinkles, and details because if you bend your thumb, there are likely some creases or wrinkles that are created on the surface. And we're going to include the top, bottom, and sides. And we're looking for something that's about the same size as your thumb, which is also an additive process. The third skill building technique is called sketching the hand in clay, where you're forming the palm and attaching the four fingers. Now this is kind of a bit of mostly subtractive. It does include some additive processes. You're not creating an ultra realistic hand, but it's just another way to think about building. So how do you start? You're going to be seeing a demonstration for each practice activity, but a great way to think about creating a hand is to chunk it into pieces, because from here, for example, I can then take these parts and score and slip them together. Later on, when we're looking at hands, you're going to think about how do I sketch a hand, because even using the way these hands are sketched can give you an idea of how to visualize when you're constructing it out of clay. So you're going to learn various
steps, tips, techniques, which will help you actually construct in hand later on for our project.